All right, good morning or good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As you guys are sitting here listening to this lecture, I am on my way up to Reno for my girls cross country team, so I hope you guys are doing well. At this point, I'm probably asleep on the bus because it is a very long and very boring bus ride as well, but that's okay. That's not really the point. Today, we are going to catch up to Mr. Bathhower's class. We're going to get through the era of good feelings, and then we're going to get into the first industrial revolution, specifically looking at it in the United States of America. I'm starting on slide 43. So I want to remind you guys of a couple things. I'm going to go by it fairly quickly. I'm really going to cut out the stories and all the extra details. Just want to go ahead and jump right into it. And then if you do need to pause me, unlike in real life, you can actually do that here. So if you need to stop me and actually write down notes, that is perfectly fine. I'm assuming that these 2 days worth of notes are going to take you about an hour in today's class. And then for the last 30 minutes of class, you'll be able to either work on your homework, which is going to be the Lowell Girls Hippo, or if you're not really feeling like working on anything too serious because it is a Friday afternoon, you'll be able to play the Four Corners game as well. And I'll have that set up for you guys. Either choice is up to you, but make sure you have the Lowell Girls Hippo done by our class on Tuesday because I will be collecting that for a grade. I'm trying to think of any other reminders. I don't think I have any, so let's go ahead and get started here. I'm not really going to do the core of the day. I'm not going to do the AMSCO. I'm cutting out all that extra stuff. I will say to period 7, this is James Monroe, and that is not a wig. That is his real hair. We were talking about that the other day, so I figured I'd point that out to you. Let's start with the era of good feelings. So this is in the War of 1812 era, in which people are just feeling good about the United States. We've turned away from Europe. We're focused much more on ourselves and expanding our country to the West. As you see, I'm still doing the hand motions here, just in case you guys missed that in real life. So there are increased feelings of nationalism, optimism, and unity. Remember, the Federalists are out of the picture. They're no longer there, and the Democratic Republicans have more or less adopted some of the Federalist policies and combined them with their own. So everyone, or not maybe not quite everyone, but a lot of people are more or less on the same page because the Democratic Republicans have tried to bring everyone into the fold, which is why they're going to dominate the office of the presidency for so long. There is still disagreement, as we're going to see. There's still disagreement over tariffs, whether we should have a national bank, what we do with public land, and of course, slavery. So there will be different factions. So to call it the era of good feelings isn't quite always 100% accurate, but certainly, we can refer to this as the era of good feelings for those various reasons that I talked about. I'm going to go ahead and put on the captions as well. Okay, hopefully that'll make things a little bit easier for you guys because I know I have a tendency to talk quickly and also mumble some of my words. The president during this time period, the era of good feelings, is James Monroe. And he's a Revolutionary War veteran, but he's also incredibly experienced. He had been a minister to Great Britain, and he was Secretary of State as well. He very much continues the Virginia dynasty. And what I mean by that Virginia dynasty is that many of our first presidents came from Virginia, which is what was one of the more powerful and more populous states during this time period. So people like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison all came from Virginia. Really, the only exception to that rule is John Adams, who was hailing from Massachusetts. Now, Monroe is going to win the 1816 and 1820 elections very easily. He's going to defeat Rufus King in 1816 and he'll actually run unopposed in 1820. The Democratic Republicans are simply just dominating politics, and Monroe is going to be the guy that they vote for. He's popular amongst the younger voters because they admire him as a former soldier. They kind of see him as coming from the older generation, but he's also promoting westward movement. So he's very much dialed into their wants and their needs and their desires. Remember, this younger generation, this generation after the founders, it's much more concerned with westward movement as opposed to being culturally connected back to Europe, which is where we really start as a country to move away from our connections to Europeans and start to establish an identity of our own. This picture here is actually a really famous one. Now, it comes from outside the time period. It actually comes from 1872, but still the point is made that the Americans will continue to expand to the West. As we see in this part right here, it appears that this might be some conflicts with natives here. So that's certainly going to be something that we need to keep in mind as the Americans expand to the West. Going back to Washington, D.C., we see Henry Clay's American system. So this is a system to promote the needs of America. What we're going to start to see is that Jefferson's party, the Democratic Republicans, are actually going to start to create Alexander Hamilton's dream. Remember, Alexander Hamilton wanted business. He thought that business was going to be the way to make the United States productive and able to compete with the British and the French. So in kind of this odd way, even though the Democratic Republicans are in power, we're still going to see pro-business moves. Now, before the War of 1812, there were incredibly low tariffs. We were a young nation. We still had to rely on the British and the French and other countries to help us out. But after the War of 1812, we want to do our own thing. We're more or less an adult country. Maybe it's better to think of it as a teenager country or a college kid country. We're still fairly young and still fairly new, still trying to figure our way out, but we want to figure it out on our own. We don't want to have to rely on other adult countries like the British or the French. So we're going to put up those walls. We're going to put up those protective tariffs that will limit competition. And that's the first point of Henry Clay's American plan. This will allow the United States to develop its own businesses, its own manufacturing, instead of having to rely on the British. This is part of the reason why the United States ends up becoming an incredibly industrialized and incredibly wealthy nation. The second point was to create a national bank. And so the second bank of the United States will be chartered, and this second bank will provide loans and money and financial wizardry to people who need it. And we'll see that some people are able to take advantage of this, others are not. And we'll talk about the divide that occurs between various groups of people a little bit later. And the last one is to focus in on internal improvements. The idea of internal improvements is to make trade easier. As I said multiple times last year, trade produces wealth for everybody. We saw that in Unit 2 of AP World History. So the easier we can make it to trade, well, the wealthier we're going to be. We're going to see a massive amount of canal building. We'll see a little bit later railroad building. We'll also see buildings of roads as well. However, there will be times where President Monroe is going to veto the canal and road building bills. It's not that he's necessarily against building new infrastructure. He just doesn't want it to come from the federal government. Remember, he's a Democratic Republican. Even though they've adopted those Federalist policies, it's still going to be run by Democratic Republicans who want a small federal government. Monroe's worried that if the federal government is the one taking charge of everything and building the canals and building the roads, he's going to have to raise taxes, he's going to have to make the government bigger, and that kind of violates some of those Democratic, Republican, or Jeffersonian principles that we talked about earlier. If you look at the political cartoon here, I know it's a little bit blurry, but we see the North is incredibly excited about this. The South, not so much. They're not going to benefit from protective tariffs. Why? They need the goods from Britain. They don't want to buy the more expensive goods from the northern part of the United States. They want to buy the cheap goods from Britain. But now those goods are significantly more expensive. If we're looking at the broader picture with these protective tariffs, this is going to divide the North and the South even more. And we're going to see a bigger and bigger divergence culturally and socially between those two parts of the country, which is certainly going to lead up to the eventual Civil War. Even though this is the era of good feelings and things are going well, we still get our first major economic problem since the Articles of Confederation, and that's the Panic of 1819. The Second Bank of the United States stopped lending money in order to control inflation, and this led to foreclosures and unemployment and a massive depression. It very much impacted the Western landowners more than it did the rich bigwigs of the East. And here's the reason why. Many of these Western landowners overspeculated on land. They thought that this land was going to be incredibly valuable, so they took out loans in order to cover the cost of those lands. Well, now they can't get those loans because the Bank of the United States has stopped lending them money. They also can't really pay off their debts because they can't get those loans in the first place. This is going to lead to many of these Western landowners to be opposed to the Bank of the United States, especially since they're being thrown into the debtor's prison, just as we saw with Bacon's Rebellion and just as we saw with Shays' Rebellion as well. So we should be able to see some sort of continuity with that. When we get to the age of Jackson, that we're not going to get to in this very quick, hopefully quickly, lecture today, we're going to see that he's going to tap into this. He's going to tap into people's hatred of the bank. He's going to say that the bank screws over farmers. It doesn't lend them money, and it's only there to protect the elites of the East, those big Wall Street banker types. We do, speaking of Jackson, here he is here, we will get some changes to the Democratic Republican Party as we're going to see this party split. There are the old timers, the Quids, who want a strict interpretation of the Constitution and very limited government. They're mainly backed by elites of the East, people like John Quincy Adams, who is the son of President John Adams. So this was a guy who would have been an elite, would have had quite a bit of power and quite a bit of money as well. There's going to be the young guns. These are in kind of the newer Democratic Republicans who adopt many of those Federalist policies and want a large army and want a large national bank, so that way they can continue to push this nationalist idea of the United States. They want to make the United States great. They want to make the United States big and powerful, and the only way to do so is by adopting those Federalist policies. We'll see a split in the 1824 election that will split the party between Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. Though even though Jackson's a Southern planter, even though he's incredibly wealthy, he very much taps into the poor vote, or the people who are at least not as wealthy. We'll talk about that more at another time, but it is important to see that this party will eventually split and Andrew Jackson will eventually become the president. Before we get to Jackson and all of that, we got to take a step back here just to remind ourselves of kind of who's working in the shadows. And that person is going to be John Marshall. It's very easy to forget about John Marshall because he's part of the judicial branch, part of the Supreme Court, not the most exciting branch of government that there is. We have a few different Supreme Court cases I want to talk about. I will not go into the detail about every single court case because you're not going to be tested on that until next year. I'm going to go into the impact or the legacy of all of these Supreme Court cases. Generally speaking, these 5 Supreme Court cases that we are going to look at give the federal government more power. If you can understand that about all 5 of these, then you at least generally understand what's going on. And the first one is Fletcher v. Peck. There was a dispute. We're not going to get into it. The main thing is that the judicial branch declared a state law unconstitutional for the first time. This is, in essence, judicial review for the states. You got to remember there's a couple different types of court systems that we have in the United States. We have federal courts that try people for federal crimes, and we have state courts that try people for state crimes. Now, what's a federal crime and what's a state crime? That's something that you'll talk about next year with Dr. Walker or Mr. Kershaw in AP Gov. As for right now, Fletcher v. Peck, judicial review, but for the states. Dartmouth College versus Woodward is going to limit the power of the state. The state of New Hampshire wanted to alter the contract of Dartmouth College. John Marshall is going to say, no, you cannot do that. You cannot alter a private contract. What this does is that it limits the power of the state. And if the power of the state is limited, that means the national government is going to have more power. So we see that through this court case, John Marshall will limit the power of the states and give the national government more power, as is generally true for all of these Supreme Court decisions. In Cohens v. Virginia in 1821, the Supreme Court can review state court decisions. So if the state court makes a decision and someone wants to appeal up to a higher court into the Supreme Court, they certainly can do so, which gives the Supreme Court more power. The 2 major ones that I want to talk about here only briefly are McCulloch v. Maryland and Gibbons v. Ogden. In McCulloch v. Maryland, the state of Maryland wanted to tax the second bank of the United States because they wanted to destroy it and get rid of it. John Marshall says that Maryland cannot do so because of the supremacy clause in the Constitution. That supremacy clause says that the federal government has supremacy or is supreme over the state government. In addition to this, he says the Bank of the United States is constitutional. Maryland had tried to say, no, it's unconstitutional, but Marshall said, no, it is because of the necessary and proper clause. In the Constitution, it states that Congress can do anything that they deem necessary and proper for the protection of the United States, something to that extent. And John Marshall is saying, according to this interpretation, the Second Bank of the United States is necessary and proper, and therefore is constitutional. This once again gives more power to the national government, taking it away from the state government. A last one is Gibbons versus Ogden. There was a dispute over interstate commerce being commerce between the states, not commerce within the states. So if Las Vegas was to trade with Reno, that is intrastate commerce, and the national government can do nothing about that. If Las Vegas was to trade goods with Los Angeles, well, that is interstate, that's across state lines, and therefore the national government can regulate that. The reason that the national government can regulate that today is because of Gibbons versus Ogden. John Marshall is going to say that the federal government could step in and regulate interstate commerce and somehow be involved with that. And the federal government will use that clause in order to expand its power, not just during the Marshall time period, but during, over the next couple hundred years as well. If we have the opportunity to talk about that, we will. If not, we won't, and you'll talk about it next year in AP Government. And that's going to be it for our first part of the lecture here. I'm going to skip the four corners. I'm going to skip over these essential questions. I'm going to skip the AMP questions and the chat as well. Let's get into Western movement and industrialization. The first thing we see is that the population is going to rapidly increase. The population will double west of the Appalachian or Appalachian Mountains, depending on your pronunciation, in the decade after the War of 1812. Why? Why are people moving west? Why are they going there? There's a few reasons why. One, there's new lands from the natives. Remember, we've had the Louisiana Purchase. We had our war heroes, William Henry Harrison and Andrew Jackson during the Creek War. So there's more land that is open for the Americans. There's also new opportunities for people. If you were in New England, there were restrictions on trade. There were people who already had quite a bit of money, quite a bit of power, and they were the gatekeepers of that society. If you moved to the West, well, that was a new opportunity for you. You could have your own plot of land, you could trade the crops that you grew, you could make money that way. If you were from the South, you needed more land. You had exhausted the soil by growing cotton or tobacco or actually literally any crop, and so you needed more soil in order to continue making more money. But most importantly, at least in my opinion, is new transportation. There's new roads, there's new canals, there's steamboats, there's railroads. There's easier ways to make it out to the West. And because it's easier, more people are much more likely to do it, and therefore they shall. Our Western states, when I say the Western states are in this time period, I'm not talking California. We'll get to California, we'll talk about the 49ers a little bit later. When I talk about the Western states, I mean the present day Midwest and kind of the New South. So Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, and Missouri. What do the people moving here want? They want easy credit. They want cheap money. They want loans from the bank that have a very, very low interest rate. So they get very upset when the Bank of the United States closes down and does not give them money, which is why they're going to rally against it, as I mentioned earlier. They also want low prices for the land. So they want the federal government to have the land and sell it to them very, very low. And then finally, they want improved transportation. One, it'll make it easy to get out there and start your new life, but most importantly, it will make it easy for them to send their resources and their crops and their goods back to the East, which is where they'll be sold, and how those people in the West are going to make quite a bit of money. We're going to see there's a lot of disagreements over slavery, which is going to lead us into the Compromise of 1820, or the Missouri Compromise. The goal is to find a balance of slave and free states. And this was the same goal that the Constitution had. You wanted to make sure that the slave states weren't overrepresented in government, but you also wanted to give them at least some representation so they wouldn't secede and break away. This is where Henry Clay is going to step back in. So Henry Clay and his American system, he's going to be the guy to continue finding a solution. And I put that in quotes there because it's not really a solution so much as it is just kind of putting a Band-Aid on it very quickly and then walking away, letting some other future generation actually deal with the real problem itself. Let's back up a little bit to figure out what we're talking about. Missouri, right here, was the first state in the Louisiana Purchase to apply for statehood. Now, there were people there who wanted slavery, and there were people there who didn't want slavery. So what is it that you do? Do you have slaves? Do you not have slaves? This is going to be a problem that's going to confront the Congress of the United States for the next 45 years, up until the Civil War. The Talmadge Amendment angered many of the Southerners. This amendment was a way to gradually end slavery. It pretty much stated, look, the slaves that are there, they're going to stay there. That's fine. That's the way that is. No more slaves can be imported, and the descendants of the slaves who were already there will be automatically free. Now, this amendment completely failed, but it angered the Southerners, because many of the Southerners are going to say, well, look, you're just trying to get rid of slavery, and just do so slowly. Like, you're trying to trick us. Instead of outright abolishing it, you're just slowly abolishing it. And we're going to see that there are other amendments that are like this that seek to slowly abolish slavery, and there will be people who see through it and are very much against it. Henry Clay's solution is to admit Missouri as a slave state. So Missouri will be a slave state, and because of representation, Maine will be admitted as a free state. So that way, the representation in Congress is still balanced, as we see in this little drawing down here. From there on out, slavery will be prohibited above the 3630 line, which is the line of latitude at the very southern border of Missouri. So anything above this line, with the exception of Missouri, will not have slavery. Anything below it is open to slavery. This leads to sectionalism, which is why I really like this map here, because you can literally see the different sections that exist and how they're going to have different incentives and different wants and needs and desires, and that's certainly going to make them diverge away from each other more and more, which, as I've already mentioned, will eventually lead to the Civil War. Let's move away from Western movement, at least for a little bit, and talk a little bit about foreign affairs before we finish up here with industrialization. We have to remember that as we're moving to the West, there's still people there. We've already talked about the natives, at least a bit with Harrison and Jackson, but the British are still there. The Russians are, in fact, in Oregon country as well. So we have to deal with those other foreign countries, and we'll see a couple different ways in which President Monroe does so. The first one is the Rush-Bagot Agreement of 1817, which limited the naval armament in the Great Lakes region. So it's really just trying to bring down the tension and the pressure between Great Britain and the United States, and it limits the border fortifications. The Treaty of 1818 is the bigger one, in which the British and the Americans are going to share fishing rights off Newfoundland, which doesn't really seem that exciting, but fishing is a way to make a whole lot of money, and so it matters to those particular individuals. It also allows for joint occupation of the Oregon Territory and sets a border between Canada, or the British possessions of Canada, and then the United States as well. What we're seeing with both of these treaties is that the tensions with the Britain after two major wars, the American Revolution and the War of 1812, are starting to ease, as Britain is going to be our ally from here on out, both in terms of economics and politics, and even going into war, as we're going to see when we get to World War I and World War II. Florida, there's some issues there, and there's still issues in Florida today. Go Google Florida man, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. But let's talk about Florida during Monroe's presidency. Spain is dealing with a lot of problems. Simón Bolívar, who we talked about last year, is leading the Latin American revolutions, and he's fairly successful at this time. And so Spain's certainly dealing with that. In addition, there are Seminoles, so Native American slaves and outlaws in Florida that are conducting raids in the U.S. territory. So they'll run to the United States, steal things, mess with people, do whatever it is they do, and then run back across the border into Florida, and therefore aren't punished. Well, this upsets Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson knows the area. He's the hero of New Orleans. He knows what's going on, and he does not mess around. He goes down there in 1817 with the support of Monroe and the Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams. He destroys Seminole villages. He drives out the British government. He hanged two British traders who were aiding the Seminoles as well. He goes all out in the way that we know Andrew Jackson does. This leads to Spain saying, you know what, we got too many problems going on here. Let's just get rid of Florida. Let's just give it to the United States, and we'll focus on the other problems, like trying to rebuild our empire in Latin America. This leads to the Florida Purchase Treaty, which is also called the Adams-Onis Treaty, named after John Quincy Adams and then the Ambassador Onis as well, of 1819, in which the U.S. will receive Florida and some of the Spanish claims to Oregon. So they'll get Florida and then this panhandle part here. And Spain's going to receive $5 million from this. This will not be the last time that the United States and Spain go into a war over land, as we're going to see the Spanish-American War at the very end of this century. Our other big foreign policy move by James Monroe is the Monroe Doctrine, and this is a document that we need to know. This is a document that is incredibly important to the history of the United States because it will be used to justify many of our foreign policy initiatives even today. So the U.S. foreign policy towards Europe and the Western Hemisphere will be very simple. Europe, stay over there. Stay on your side of the Atlantic Ocean. Do not interfere with the Americas. We'll see about a century later, during the Teddy Roosevelt administration, that he is going to build upon the Monroe Doctrine. He will say that not only are Europeans not allowed, that America will deal with any problems in the Americas, which will include all of South America as well. And that's what I'm making with this point here, is that future presidents will use this Monroe Doctrine as a justification of their foreign policy initiative. Now, this Monroe Doctrine is really a bluff if you think about it. Monroe doesn't really have the power to tell Europe what to do. These countries are significantly more powerful and have way more money than little old United States here. What's really stopping the Europeans from messing with the Americas is Great Britain. So Great Britain has set up a blockade around Europe in order to stop people like Napoleon from doing whatever it is that Napoleon did during the Napoleonic Wars. They want to keep the balance of power in Europe. So it's not so much the Monroe Doctrine that stops the European nations from messing with the Americas, but rather the British and the fact that all of these European nations are sick and tired of wars. They've had their own revolutions. They've had to deal with the Napoleonic Wars. They don't want to deal with the Americans anyway. Let's go ahead and move into industrialization. This will be our last topic, and then that will wrap up this lecture. And hopefully by the end of this, we'll be all caught up with Mr. Bathhower's class, and then everything will be hopefully smooth sailing from here on out. So we have the first industrial revolution at the end of the 1700s and the beginning of the 1800s, in which we're going to see less dependence upon farming and more dependence on manufacturing. So once again, Democratic Republican president, but a Hamiltonian kind of federalist dream. And we're going to see a massive population increase. There's an incredibly high birth rate because more people have access to more food in the Americas. So the birth rate's just going to naturally bring up the population. In addition to that, we're going to get a lot of German and Irish immigration during this particular time period. There's a lot of things going on in Europe. There's a lot of starvation that's occurring. There's a lack of access to land. There's lack of access to food as well. We have the revolution of 1830. There's even the failed revolutions of 1848. There's a lot of fighting. There's a lack of food. There's a lot of reasons to get out. And so many of these Germans and many of the Irish are going to make their way over to the New World, and mainly doing so for economic opportunities. By the 1830s, about a third of the population will be west of the Appalachian, which, as if we put it in actual numbers here, goes from 4 million to 13 million. So that's a rapid increase in only a couple generations there. Why is it that so many people are moving to the west? Just as we said before, we're getting new roads, we're getting canals, we're getting steamboats and railroads. Most of these roads are going to be private initiatives, which is why they have to be toll roads, because if you build a road privately without tax dollars, that is, then you have to find a way to pay for all of that. So they're going to charge tolls. There will be some national roads, like the national road, which is now US 40. But for the most part, as we said earlier, Monroe doesn't want the federal government to be the one directing the construction of roads. He wants the state governments to do it. So there won't be as many national roads, at least not yet. You also get the Erie Canal, which is going to connect, especially Michigan, but the Midwest, all the way to New York City. This is important for us to keep in mind for two reasons. One, the economic reason being that the canal allows the people over here to make money. This gives an incentive for people to continue moving to the West. This is a way to make money, not just by growing crops for yourself, but by growing crops and shipping them back to the markets back east, in which people are going to want to consume them, and therefore they will pay you for that privilege of having food. But secondly, it also connects the United Nations culturally. When you are a state, like let's say you have the state of Michigan here, and you only have to interact with other people in Michigan, well, you're going to consider yourself a Michigander. But if you're a person who, via the canals, has to trade with New York and people in New York City, well, now you're considering yourself outside of Michigan. You were interacting with people who aren't from your immediate surrounding. And so we're starting to see more of a national identification because of these connections due to the new technology that exists. The steamboats are just going to make the canals even better, as steamboats are going to be significantly faster at bringing goods to the market, such as Robert Fulton's Claremont. And then railroads, one of my personal favorite pieces of technology, will first be built in the 1820s, and they're going to help grow these Midwest towns. We live in a pretty much a railroad town, Las Vegas. Las Vegas was a stop on the way to LA, and eventually this town grew into what it is today. Many other cities are going to get their start that way as well, especially places like Chicago, as many of the cattle ranchers are going to bring their meat to the railroads. Those railroads will take it to Chicago, and Chicago from there will chop up the meat and disseminate it to other parts in the east. So we're going to see that Chicago turns from a tiny little town into a sprawling metropolis because of its connection to the railroads. So we do want to be aware of not only what technology exists, but what the economic and cultural impacts of that technology are. That's kind of taking history and putting it to the next level, seeing the actual impact of these new pieces of technology. We continue to have more industrial growth as manufacturing will outperform agriculture, and we get a few inventions to help make that a possibility. The first one will be Samuel Slater, who secretly brings plans from Britain to the United States in 1791, and he will set up a factory system in Rhode Island. And he will make it a center of manufacturing. The fact that there is water there helps the water wheel continue to churn, which will help the manufacturing system grow more and more. So Samuel Slater is often credited with being the father of American manufacturing, and we'll talk about those factories and the lifestyle in those factories momentarily. Our other big individual is Eli Whitney, who will make a couple different key inventions. The first one's going to be the cotton gin in 1793. Now, Eli Whitney actually created the cotton gin as a way to get rid of slavery. After all, the cotton gin was going to be a way to make it easier to pick the seeds out of cotton. When you pick cotton, the seeds are still in it, and you would have to pick those seeds out by hand. That takes a long time, which means it took a longer time for cotton to get to the market, but it also meant that there was an incentive to bring in more slaves. His idea, if you could put the cotton in a machine and just turn the wheel that would automatically pick out the seeds, well, now you can produce more cotton more quickly, and therefore would not have an incentive to have so many slaves. The exact opposite happened because cotton could so easily be picked and the seeds could be taken out, it led to an increase in demand for cotton and therefore an increase in demand for slaves. So we see that even after 1793, as the cotton gin is invented around here, the amount of slaves along with the amount of cotton production is going to skyrocket due to the cotton gin. The other part is the interchangeable parts. We kind of take this for granted today. Like if something breaks in your computer or whatever technology you have, you can go to the store and just get that part. That wasn't true in the 1700s and the 1800s. If you had some sort of technology, right now I'm thinking of a gun because most people at that time had some sort of musket at home. If your musket broke, well, you had to take it to a person who had to create an entirely new part or sometimes had to create an entirely new gun. But if you could have the same part for a gun and you could just easily swap out the parts, well, that makes things a lot easier for you. The person who's going to take the idea of interchangeable parts and take it to the extreme is going to be Henry Ford, and we'll talk about that more once we get to the assembly line in the early 1900s. Lastly, there's going to be new corporations, and these corporations will begin in New York City, the financial capital of the world, and they will sell stocks in factories, canals, railroads, and all of that stuff. So we have big businesses today that sell stocks. Well, this time period, the late 1700s and early 1800s, is where we start to get big national corporations who can ship their goods not just to their local area, but by using the canals and railroads to a nationwide audience, which is certainly going to connect the United States together economically and culturally as well. Let's get into factories and unions. I think I have a couple slides after this, and that will be it. In Lowell, Massachusetts, there will be a textile industry or a textile factory. And not only will it be the factory, but it'll actually be the entire town. The people who work in the factory live in a town that's paid for by the factory. So there will be dormitories, there will be shops there as well. It's mainly going to be populated by people who do not have economic opportunities. Men are ones who have economic opportunities. They can go get some cheap land out west and start a farm. Women, children, immigrants don't really have the money to do so. So they oftentimes are taken advantage of and put into the factory system, especially since you can pay women and children and immigrants less money. Because of this, unions are going to start to organize in order to combat those horrible working conditions that we talked about last year. They'll fight against the long hours, they'll fight against the low pay as well. However, unions will have problems. There will be immigrant workers who come in and are willing to work for that low pay, meaning that the union system isn't really going to work. We'll have state laws and federal laws that will outlaw unions, or if they go on strike, at least try to break up those strikes. In addition, we're going to have depressions and high unemployment. We'll continue looking at unions throughout this century. So we'll see it in this time period and in our next time period as well. And actually even beyond that, all the way up to the early 1900s. We're going to see that in terms of agriculture, we're moving away from Jefferson's dream of subsistence farming and more to Hamilton's dream of commercial farming. Because land in the West was so cheap and because banks gave out loans, in addition to that, because transportation was so good, at least relatively speaking, the West could now send their goods and their food to the East and to the South. So you had an incentive to grow more food that you can actually eat so that way you could sell it and make a profit. This is how we're starting to get these big farms instead of these small subsistence farming that we're commonly used to. Cotton also becomes king, not tobacco. So tobacco had saved the Jamestown colony, had saved Virginia, but cotton at this point becomes king. As many people from the South continue to expand to the West, they're going to use that land for cotton in order to fulfill the demand for textile goods. Lastly, we get the market revolution. You're going to have factories and farmers that were interdependent. They relied on one another. Farmers fed the workers. Workers produced mass-produced goods for those farmers. Everyone's standard of living increased. You're also going to see some women take those factory jobs, like in Lowell, and that's what our hippo is going to be about today as well. They were generally single, young, unmarried women who didn't really have many economic opportunities. Now, I don't want you to think that factory jobs were common for women. They usually weren't. Usually, if you were a woman in the city, you worked in the domestic service, so you would work as a server, or you would work in teaching, kind of tapping into that idea of Republican motherhood, which also helps to explain why teaching, especially at the elementary level, is dominated by women today. You're also going to see an increase in wealth. So wages increase and everyone's wages start to go up, which is good, but that wealth gap starts to widen very rapidly. The rich become very, very wealthy and the poor become a little more wealthy, but they certainly are far behind the wealthiest of the Americans. This new wealth is going to create a middle class. So instead of having poor farmers and elites of the East, you're going to have a middle class of people who actually have a little bit of disposable income. And we're going to see that as that middle class grows over the next century, they're going to have a profound impact on the culture of the United States. It will help to explain why sports like baseball start to develop, because people will actually have free time and disposable income to spend to go to baseball games. But that's for another unit. We will see separate spheres for middle class men and middle class women. If you're a middle class man, you got to be working. You're in the factory, you're doing some sort of job. But if you're a middle class woman, you are in the home. That is your separate world. That is your sphere. You are not supposed to be in the factory working. You are supposed to be at home taking care of the home and educating the children. Now, even though women are still put into the home and we still see this idea of Republican motherhood, it's still more mobile socially, and there's still more economic opportunities than what we saw in Europe. There's still a lot of social mobility, relatively speaking, and way more economic opportunities. And we'll talk about this more as we get closer to the 1900s as well, because it will help to explain why many more immigrants are going to continue coming to the United States. Slavery will continue to increase because of the market. The market demands more cotton and more textile goods, and slavery provides that cotton and provides those textile goods. That's going to be it for the lecture here. So I'll go ahead and stop this. You guys will need to just finish up the notes, and then you'll go ahead and, as a class, decide whether you're going to play the Four Corners game or whether you're going to get a jump start on your homework and look at the Lowell Girls Hippo. That's it for today. If you do have questions, because I breezed through that very quickly, just write them down in your notebook, hang on to them, and then I will address them on Tuesday. Take care, guys, and I hope you guys all have a wonderful weekend.